Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining on this live stream. Joining us on this live stream, I got my colleague and friend here, Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, and today we're going to be talking about a recent video that popular atheist YouTuber Paulogia put out, reacting to your debate with him, Jonathan, that you did with. What was that? A couple months ago? When was that debate? February?
Yeah, it was back in January.
January. Okay, so it was kind of a little while ago, and you guys debated on the topic of the resurrection on capturing Christianity. And Paulogia had some thoughts to offer regarding that debate and some takeaways, and some of them were pretty interesting. And so we're definitely going to get into those. So we're just going to basically just run through. I got clips of the video. I will later post in the description the entire video, just so everybody can watch Paulogia's video for reference and just know that we're not just trying to like quote mine him or anything else like that. I just, for the sake of time, it's a 40-minute video. I condensed it down to about 20 minutes. I also sped them up to about 1.5. And so I hope you guys don't mind that. But for those of you who are watching this, maybe later, an archived version, and you're one of those people like me who likes to watch everything at twice the speed, no, Paulogia doesn't talk at Ben Shapiro's speed. And so he's just sped up a little bit. So you may just want to adjust accordingly. And so now, the debate was about the resurrection, but Paulogia wanted to, the way that the debate was titled and the way that he kind of demanded that the debate be titled, or at least asked Cameron to title it, was like very specific. It was a physical resurrection required for the development of modern Christianity? And I just found that to be very carefully worded. And so I'm going to go ahead and let Paulogia kind of explain. And then feel free, Jonathan, to just pause me at any time. We do got like about 7 or 8 chapters that we're going to go through here on the different topics. And so, yeah, without further ado, we'll let Paulogia speak here.
To evaluate my overall argument and performance, and debates do tend to be more about performance than argument, but there were a few observations and clarifications that I wanted to make, starting with some frustration around the debate topic.
Today what we're doing is a debate on the resurrection of Jesus. What was required for Christianity to begin was a physical resurrection required. We've got some feedback actually.
Unfortunately, some early technical problems ended up derailing the topic introduction. I noticed after the fact that on screen was what was required for Christianity to begin. But that's not what was agreed. What was agreed was the title of the video. Was a physical resurrection required for the development of modern Christianity? In our email exchange setting up the conversation, Jonathan asked, Paul, what topics are you interested in discussing? I proposed, was a literal physical resurrection required for the development of modern Christianity? Jonathan replied, sure, happy to discuss that topic. And so that's what I came in to discuss.
Does the existence of Christianity require an actual, physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus? Is it an absolute, unwavering, unquestionable prerequisite? In the same way that fire requires oxygen to burn, or that an animal requires the same to live. This is the central tenet of Christianity, but does Christianity need it to be explained? As far as my evidential journey has taken me, I found no aspect of church existence, no aspect of church history that requires a resurrection. If you find a resurrection to be plausible, or even probable, or preferred for whatever reason, that's all well and good. But I trust that the intellectually honest among those listening today will come to realize that Jesus rising is not the only narrative that fits all the facts.
But this wasn't what Jonathan came to discuss.
I'm just going to get right in. We're talking about the case for the resurrection.
Now, I asked for this specific wording for a specific reason. I'm growing weary of apologists who braggadociously declare that naturalistic explanations in some way fail to explain historical data.
I'm not going to put forward one of the naturalistic theories. They've been shot full of holes.
They'll say, here's like 8 other ways you can explain this. Well, guess what? Why do you have 8? Why not just 1? Because those don't work, and you know they don't work.
These naturalistic explanations all turn out to be pretty hopeless. They really, really are implausible and don't do the trick.
But as soon as opening statements were done and the conversation began, Jonathan just tossed the mutually agreed debate topic aside to a less rigorous one he was willing to defend.
So, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts, and then we'll let the conversation happen organically.
I'm wondering about your use of the word required and what you mean by required. I mean, when I put forward my case for the resurrection, I'm arguing that the resurrection is the best explanation of the dead. I'm not arguing that it's logically necessitated by the evidence. So what do you mean when you say required?
What I wanted to hopefully get to today was either to some kind of agreement that there are naturalistic explanations that fit all the evidence.
So basically, this is the argument in a nutshell. We possess.
Okay. So that's basically, he's, like I said, complaining about the way that the debate was kind of changed topics. And he seemed to be pretty frustrated with that. And so, and it seems like he's kind of accusing you of like switching the subject. And even later in the video, like he basically says that you admit, okay, well, it's not necessarily required for Christianity to exist. And he in a sense, is almost like, okay, well, I won, but I guess we still have this other conversation that we have to have. And so, was that kind of your assessment? And what are your thoughts on here, Jonathan?
So I wasn't expecting Paulogia to come to the debate with such a stringent definition of required. It seems to me that what he means by required is logically necessitated, that the resurrection is logically necessary in order for Christianity to exist. And of course, no historian worth his salt is going to defend such a position. That's just the nature of historical inquiry. We can't arrive at such firm dogmatic certitudes where we say that that a particular explanation is logically necessitated by the data, and all other candidate hypotheses are impossible. Rather, it's long been my position that the case for the resurrection renders the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead the best explanation of the pertinent facts. And as such, it significantly raises the probability of Christianity being true relative to what it would have otherwise been. And then there's, of course, other independent lines of evidence which further support the truth of Christianity as well, such as the trilemma argument, the argument from that's most famously associated with C.S. Lewis, and then there's the conversion of the Apostle Paul, messianic prophecy argument, the argument from contemporary miracles, the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds, and so forth. And all of those arguments individually raises the probability of Christianity being true relative to what it would have otherwise been. And I would argue that when you consider all of these different lines of evidences in aggregate, it strongly compels belief in the truth of Christianity. But it's not my position, never has been, that the resurrection is logically necessitated by the data. Rather, it is the best explanation of the pertinent facts. I think that the pertinent data relating to the resurrection makes the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead significantly more likely than not. And that's what I came to defend.
Right. And I mean, my thinking was, it's like, again, it's just a very weird way to phrase it. I mean, you could explain the development of modern Judaism without, a historical Abraham or a historical Moses. I suppose if you really wanted to, you could explain the existence of the Emancipation Proclamation without there being an Abraham Lincoln. But it requires a whole lot of extra explanations, and it just doesn't hold up as well as a simple explanation would. And so, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, I did want to clarify one thing, because I did say in the debate that Paul and I both reject young Earth creationism, but young Earth creationist explanations of the scientific evidence are logically possible. Any explanation of any set of facts is logically possible and can be shown to be consistent with the data if you are prepared to invoke enough auxiliary hypotheses. And so if you make a hypothesis, you can invoke a lot of ad hoc hypotheses to make a particular position fit all of the evidence. And you can do that for essentially anything. And unfortunately, some people in the comments on the debate took that to be saying that young Earth creationism is plausible, which is not the same thing, right? I mean, the moon landing conspiracy theory is possible. I mean, you can invoke enough auxiliary hypotheses to explain away all the facts. That doesn't mean I think it's plausible. And so, likewise, I would argue that naturalistic explanations of the relevant evidence when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus are logically possible. I just think that the resurrection thesis has the greatest explanatory power, explanatory scope, and plausibility relative to any other contending hypothesis.
Right. And I mean, it's hard for me to not escape the idea, at least in my head, that Paul wanted the debate to be specifically titled that way, to be able to get a clear path to be able to say that, hey, I won the debate. Technically, there are other explanations, and Christianity could exist, or the development of modern Christianity could exist without the resurrection. And I guess, I mean, that's just such a unspectacular and kind of trivial conclusion to me. I don't know. And so it just seems like even if he gets a W there, it's just kind of it's kind of a cheap win. It's like, okay, well, so what? And so, but I guess I could understand. I'm trying to put myself in Paulogia's shoes. And there's even a commenter here on the chat that says, here, I'll just put his chat up here. It says, whatever your take is on the wording of the requested topic, it's disingenuous to change the topic last minute without first consenting the debaters. And so like, how would you respond to Paulogia or this particular comment who says that it's just like wrong to switch subjects, when you agreed upon it before and then you come to the debate with something else?
We were debating the topic of the resurrection. That's what the topic of the debate was agreed upon. As for Paulogia's definition of the word required, I wasn't expecting him to bring such a stringent definition of required to the table. I mean, Paulogia has followed my work for some time. We've engaged in 2 debates. This was the second debate I've done with him on the resurrection, and he knows my positions, and he knows that I'm going to be defending that the resurrection is the best explanation of the relevant evidence. And as a scholar, I prefer to understate my conclusions and overprovide with the evidence, rather than the other way around, where I overstate the conclusions and then underprovide with the evidence. And so I prefer to make the more modest claim that the resurrection is the best explanation of the evidence, and then let the viewer decide to what extent I've surpassed that stated objective.
Okay, fair enough. So we're going to go to the next clip here, and this is going to be, he's going to complain a little bit about, is there no difference between like a second-hand account and a 10th-hand account when he's protesting against Mark and Luke being historical sources. And so here we go.
A testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus rose physically from the dead and appeared to them alive. We'll talk about some of the evidence for that.
Let's just clarify for a second that only 2 of the gospel writers are allegedly eyewitnesses, not all 4.
Even you wouldn't say that Mark or Luke, for example, were eyewitnesses. They were reporting what was told to them, right? They're at least secondhand.
They are secondhand, but I would argue that they're very close up to people who were firsthand.
Where secondhand is indistinguishable from third hand, fourth hand, 10th hand. But that's another topic for another video. But wait, let's go back to that opening statement.
Okay, so I'll stop right there for now. That was just a quick nugget. He says it's a topic for another video, but I kind of found this a little shocking, because if Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, and likewise Mark was Peter's interpreter, then I can't possibly see how like this supposed second hand is no better than like third hand, fifth hand, 10th hand. I mean, it's just kind of an absurd thing to say. Luke and Mark were likely trusted confidants of their respective mentors, and they would have had ample opportunity to verify the accounts, talk to people. We know that if Luke was a traveling companion with Paul, and we're definitely prepared to give plenty of evidence for that particular proposal. We know that he was in Jerusalem with Paul in Acts chapter 21. And so it just seems to me like, I don't know why you would do this with these particular documents unless you're just almost having, and I'm not saying that, I don't like throwing out the word bias, but it's almost like, how would you not be biased against them? We wouldn't do this with like other documents from other history. But, when it's the Gospels, well, it doesn't matter if Luke and Mark were traveling companions of apostles. Like, we don't know if it's any better than 10th hand. Now, maybe he'd argue like something a little bit different. I don't know if he's just granting for the sake of argument that they could be written by traveling companions of these apostles, or maybe he's not. Maybe he wants to argue something completely, the opposite, contrary to that. But I think at that point, we'd just be prepared to, give counter arguments for that. And so I don't know. What are your thoughts on that particular claim you made?
You're completely correct regarding Luke, and I refer viewers and indeed Paul to my lengthy essay on my website on the evidential contribution of Luke Acts to the case for the resurrection, where I develop this argument in some detail. But basically, the argument is this, that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. I take that to be very firmly established by the historiographical evidence. And that being the case, we can place Luke, as you mentioned, with Paul in Acts 21 when Paul visits the Jerusalem church, and it mentions all the Jerusalem leaders, including James, who is, of course, the leader of the Jerusalem church, were present. And Luke was present with Paul also during Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea Maritima for at least 2 years subsequent, and that's fairly close to Jerusalem. He not only does he claim in his prologue of his gospel that he received information in some sense from eyewitnesses, he doesn't elaborate exactly in what sense he received information from eyewitnesses in his prologue, but we can show from the book of Acts that he was someone who had direct access to those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And so Luke was in a position to know what the witnesses were saying concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus. And so the question becomes, okay, is he giving us an accurate report of his understanding of the apostolic belief. And there's a few lines of evidence that suggest that he is. One would be that Luke has a demonstrated track record of meticulous historical reportage, both in Acts and things that we can also cross-check in the Gospel of Luke. And that suggests that he's trying to give us an honest report of his understanding of what was going on. Secondly, Luke traveled with Paul, and he was witness to persecutions and trials, imprisonments, and so forth that Paul was subjected to, and himself risked his own life and liberty for the sake of the gospel. And so that also goes some ways towards establishing that he was sincere in his statements concerning Christian belief and practice. And so it seems very unlikely or very implausible on that basis that he would lie about his understanding of what the apostles were claiming. And then there's also particular details pertaining to the resurrection narratives, such as the identity of the woman at the empty tomb and so forth, that I've written about elsewhere and spoken about elsewhere, that we can actually confirm directly is probably historically accurate. And so given those considerations, I would contend that we have good reason to think that Luke, even though he wasn't himself a direct eyewitness to Jesus' resurrection, is giving us an accurate report of what the apostles were claiming, and thus it's of evidential value in establishing the resurrection, because then we can move to the trilemma of, okay, what best explains the apostolic claim to have encountered the risen Jesus alive from the dead? Is it that they're honestly mistaken? Is it that they're lying? Or did Jesus in fact rise from the dead? And of course, as we've argued many times before, the content of the claim makes it enormously unlikely that they were honestly mistaken. It's a sort of claims about which it's very difficult to be honestly mistaken, involving group sightings, group conversations, physical contact, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in the case of 7 disciples in John 21. It involves extended discourses, including a Bible study, and it's extended across a 40-day time period. It's very difficult to be honestly mistaken. And then the context of the apostolic claim, in particular, the willingness to endure and face hardships and trials and imprisonments and floggings and beatings and in some cases martyrdom on account of their claim that Jesus was raised from the dead, that goes a long way towards establishing they were at least sincere in that claim. And so if they're not lying and they're not honestly mistaken, the best explanation of the facts is that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. And that's actually a perfect segue, because what he's going to propose next is a total mischaracterization of that particular position. And so that, well, anyways, you guys can see for yourselves here in just a moment. But yeah, the telephone game analogy here that he kind of alludes to in some of his illustrations in the background there, I just don't think apply at all. And so continue on to the next clip here. This one is the real whopper here that I just was a jaw dropper for me.
Statement.
Is it that they're honestly mistaken, that they lied about it, or is it Jesus rose from the dead, or indeed perhaps a combination thereof?
That's not 3 options. That's 4 options. Lying, mistaken, accurate, or option D, a combination of A, B, and C. Did I get that right? Or was that an understandable heat of the moment slip of the tongue by Jonathan?
There are basically 3 broad explanatory categories that could give an account of why the person made the claim that they did. One is that they're honestly mistaken, one is that they lied, and one is that they're telling the truth. And in some circumstances, you could have a combination thereof.
So this trilemma is a false trichotomy. There are at least 4 options from which we can choose. So I pressed Jonathan on how he can so confidently eliminate this 4th option, that some portions of the Gospels could reflect reality, and other portions be sincere mistakes. In defending them, this biologist shockingly dismissed the entire enterprise of historical inquiry in the name of his ideology.
It seems like you would like me to paint a broad brush of saying that if it's accurate here, that it's accurate across the board. And I don't want to treat that document, any of the documents, in that monolithic fashion, right? That one pericope can be true and one pericope can be false.
So I agree with that in principle, but I disagree with the pericope by pericope approach to historiography, because I think that you can make an inductive argument where you treat these documents as whole sources, as whole documents, and that you can make an inductive case for treating a document as being substantially trustworthy.
If that's where you want to put the Gospels, for me, that's a first case in history where someone's saying, well, this document is just reliable across the board. Like, that doesn't seem like a thing that a historian would say.
It doesn't matter to me what historians in fact do. What matters to me is what they ought to do.
It doesn't matter to me what historians do. It matters what they ought to do.
And so I completely, it doesn't impress me to say scholars do this or don't do that. What impresses me was an argument for what they ought to be doing. And I think that treating them in this manner is good historical practice.
Okay, so You disagree with how historians treat history on this point.
I disagree in particular with how gospel scholars treat the gospels in this pericope by pericope approach. I mean, you do see sources that are often said to be generally trustworthy or generally untrustworthy. For example, Josephus tends to be trustworthy on things that were within his own lifetime, but far less trustworthy when he's reaching back into the past before his time and so forth. But I think that the Gospels and Acts are incredibly trustworthy, as documented by the numerous points of historical confirmation that I've alluded to many times.
You're saying that the Gospels and Acts are a special case in history how is this not special pleading?
Because I'm appealing to evidence to show that the Gospels and Acts are incredibly historically reliable, and I would say of a very, very they're at a very, very high tier in terms of their historical reliability.
Are there no other documents in history that attempted to be as accurate as they did?
I would not be surprised if the Gospels and Acts are among the most, if not the most, historically trustworthy sources from that time period.
Jonathan, do you acknowledge that this is not the way historians treat any other document? And what he said back was, well, I'm not here to talk about what historians do. I'm here to talk about what historians should do.
Oh, so then is the answer to your question that historians should treat documents as 100% true or 100% false?
Yes, and he went on to defend the position that all history should be done taking documents completely at face value or throwing them in the garbage with no middle ground, because that's how he wanted the Gospels to be treated, right? He wanted to be able to say that because there are some true things in the Gospels, that therefore they are 100% true.
But what if there were false things in the Bible? Shouldn't we then consider them 100% false? Like, in my view, what he's done there is set it up so that if you can disprove anything anywhere in the Bible, you get to chuck the whole thing out.
Which is not a problem to him, because they are ways to harmonize literally anything that you want to bring up. If there is an escape hatch, then it is not something false.
A similar thing in scholarship that I often strongly disagree with is the disdain for harmonization, which I think is a very good historical practice. And so regardless of whether scholars like to harmonize, I think they should like to harmonize.
It's very clear that there are statements there where each proposition must be evaluated independently. There's a reason that propositional logic doesn't begin with, here's a book by so-and-so, either the whole book is true or not. And, you pointing out that historians don't do it this way, when he talks about, I'm not talking about what historians do, what they should do. They should do it the way they do. Nobody should be looking at something where multiple statements all have to be accepted as a package deal. I mean, this is kissing Hank's ass 101.
So in order to make Jonathan's case and accept his conclusion that the Gospels are immune from being correct in some parts, but incorrect in other parts, he's asking us to put these documents as sole members of a new and unprecedented category, completely unique in all of human history. He's asking us to put these documents.
Okay. So, yeah, there's just so much going on there. I'll let you start.
Sure. I mean, what a mess. Paul has debated me twice at this point, and he's listened to my material on multiple occasions. He's commented on it on his channel. I'm sure he's read some of my blog posts. He surely knows better than this. You and I and Tim and Lydia have done response videos to Paul, which I'm sure he's watched. Does he really think I'm that stupid to think that historical documents are either 100% accurate or 100% inaccurate? I mean, where is this coming from? That's not what I said in the debate. What I said, and what I've long said, is that I disagree with the pericope by pericope approach, where every time we approach a new proposition in the Gospels, we have to feign amnesia and forget the track record that these authors have shown of accurate and truthful reportage. And so I'm not an inerrantist. I've long said that. I've published an essay on my website about why I'm not an inerrantist. I actually do think that there are a small number of minor good faith mistakes in the Gospels, and I can identify where those are, and yet I think that they are very strongly, substantially trustworthy sources. And so, given their substantial trustworthiness, one has an inductive basis for treating a new statement that we find in the Gospels, or the next statement that we come to, as having evidence for its veracity simply by the fact that those trustworthy sources state it to be so. And we do this in every other realm of experience. If you have a close friend, for example, who has a track record of being trustworthy and reliable, and he tells you a piece of information, you are inclined to trust him and take his word for it, even in the absence of independent evidence, because this person has a track record of honest, reliable reportage. And to the extent to which someone has a track record for reliable, honest reportage, that's the extent to which that source will carry evidence in favor of any proposition that it puts forward. Whereas if someone has a track record of being unreliable, then you're going to be less inclined to trust their claims. And so that doesn't require that source or that individual be inerrant. you can be an errant source and still highly reliable. And if you're highly reliable, then when you make a statement, that the fact that you made the statement it constitutes evidence, prima facie evidence, that that statement is in fact true, even in the absence of direct confirmation.
Right. So there's a question here from a fellow YouTuber, hats off. Enjoy his channel. We've kind of interacted a little bit before, and I just thought I'd throw it on the screen here because it definitely fits. He says, apparently he thinks that you should be more wary about disagreeing with professional historians when it comes to doing history. That seems like a fair criticism to me. Now, I'll let you respond to that, but I just wanted to kind of jump in for just a second. Basically, what we're saying is that the way that New Testament studies is done with the passage by passage approach is basically they're using like the criteria, right? Like the criteria of embarrassment, or the criteria of dissimilarity or multiple attestation, and all of these different criteria. And we're basically saying what they're basically doing is they're like, okay, well, how can we find like what's trustworthy based on these criteria in the Gospels, to mine out like what facts that we think we can get out. So like, for example, the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. Okay. Supposedly that fulfills like a criterion of embarrassment, because why is Jesus getting baptized? And, you know, there's more to it than that, but that's just kind of one example. And what we're saying is like, that's a wrong-headed approach, because we're not just like, okay, every parable, every particular story, we're just going to start with the presumption that these documents are unreliable and have to establish every single thing that they say. Because what we can do is we can, through looking at various lines of evidence, like external confirmations, undesigned coincidences, and we find that the gospel authors are trustworthy over and over and over again. We're not just like starting from scratch. It's like one of the illustrations I heard Lydia McGrew use in her criticisms of the passage by passage approach is it's like, imagine you have like a freshly baked loaf of bread. Well, you might cut off the end, and you might cut off some more end, you know, another end, and you might try some pieces in the middle, but you're not like testing every single little piece of bread to make sure that it's a good loaf of bread. Like you've tested it, you know, it's a good loaf of bread, so you're going to serve it, right? And so that's just one illustration that I found particularly helpful. And so I just think that the criteriological approach, it's just very limited, and it doesn't treat the documents as wholes.
Right.
And that's our biggest criticism, at least, you know, yeah, I think that's our biggest criticism.
Absolutely agree. I would also add that New Testament scholarship is rife with bad epistemology. And I will not shy away from pointing out bad epistemology when it presents itself in New Testament scholarship. And I don't care what New Testament scholars disagree, or what New Testament scholars are employing bad methodology. If I point out a flaw in your methodology, and your response is to say, well, we make this flaw all the time, that doesn't help me with my concern. Right. Or if I point out a fallacy in your approach, and you say, oh, we make this fallacy all the time, that doesn't help. And so I'm sorry, simply because someone's a professional historian doesn't make them inerrant when it comes, or infallible when it comes to sound epistemological approaches to historiography. And I think that the pericope by pericope, or passage by passage approach to the Gospels is bad epistemology, for the reason that Erik's already expounded, that we don't need to feign amnesia and pretend that we're beginning from square one every time we come to a fresh pericope in the Gospel accounts. We can build an inductive argument for treating these documents as being substantially trustworthy, such that when we encounter the next pericope that is given to us in the Gospels, that in itself provides a prima facie basis for taking it to be so, even without independent direct corroboration.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It's not when we're saying historians, we're specifically referring to biblical scholarship, New Testament scholarship. We're not saying like all historians do this with every, I mean, maybe they do use some of the criterion, but it's more of a New Testament studies thing. It came, a lot of these criterion were developed in like the third quest for the historical Jesus. I understand that like William Lane Craig and other Christian like apologists and scholars use this criteria as well, and sometimes they'll use it in order to make a case for what they feel like is historical in the Gospels, and so maybe that's what people are just used to hearing. But we're trying to point out, like, no, your very foundation is just off kilter. This is a terrible approach. There's a lot of different things, epistemologically speaking, that the discipline as a whole. I mean, don't even get me started on like something like redaction criticism, where it's just basically like, I can invent a motive of why this tiny little change is in Luke, that, you know, why he differs a little bit from Mark. Like, that's not epistemologically sound. There's a lot of these different things that we point out. We're prepared to point them out. And I think people get very, I don't know, defensive of the discipline because, hey, these are PhDs, and Jonathan, you're just a biologist after all, and Erik, you're just a YouTuber. But again, it doesn't matter like who is making the arguments. A lot of these things that are getting pointed out, like from Lydia McGrew, I mean, she's an epistemologist. She focuses on epistemology. Like I think she's going to be able to see, like, when you're looking at evidence in a crooked and strange way, she's going to be able to see that even if she is an outsider, and point out like, hey, there's some real deficiencies here. And so, yeah, I just think this is why it's really important. Because I know Paul had kind of responded a little bit strangely on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I still get the screenshots and everything. I'm sure you guys can probably imagine how it is. We're not here to like bash, you know, Paulogia and be like, how could you do this? But at the same time, this is like, to me, I just felt like this was kind of like inexcusable. It was just like, you have so much published writing in this particular area. There's other people that he knows that we're drawing this information from and why we disagree. And it's just like, this is just a ridiculous straw man. And like, when you have an audience the size of his, and I need to do this too, I mean, as a fellow creator, we need to be willing to say like, hey, like, I got this wrong. You know, I mischaracterized this, and at least be able to own up to that. And it seemed to me like his response was just kind of like, you're being a baby and just doubling down. And I found that to be really disappointing because I've enjoyed my conversations with the guy. We've had cordial discussions before in the past. I like the guy personally. And so I was just, I'm not trying to give the disappointed dad talk, but I guess I kind of am. It's just like, we got to do better than this. We need to use our audience and our platform to steel man the other side, not straw man them, and to where, you know, they can't respond on the same kind of level of platform that he has with like over 110,000 subscribers.
Right. Paulogia has 109,000 subscribers, and I consider it to be very irresponsible to so egregiously misrepresent his previous debate opponents when they have a fraction of the size of YouTube platform that they have and don't have the ability to correct themselves. And I took Paulogia to task in the comment section of his video, and to his credit, he did pin my comment, but he's nonetheless has on Twitter and elsewhere doubled down upon his original statement, has refused to own his egregious misrepresentation of my views, and basically hasn't even acknowledged that he misrepresented me. And so I find that to be very disappointing. And it does suggest, as Erik has already elaborated on, it does suggest that he just hasn't read our material, hasn't watched our videos, hasn't read the literature on this subject. And that's very disappointing for someone who attempts to be a specialist in these areas.
Yeah, and for fairness, I mean, if anybody sees something that I'm responding to in any of their videos and they feel like that I've unfairly like represented them, then I want to like take a look at that. I want to investigate that. I want to own up to that. I have made mistakes before in the past. You know, I have tried to be transparent about that. We're all human beings. We all make mistakes, but like the proper response when you make a mistake is not like, well, let me just mock the guy on Twitter. The proper response is be like, hey man, I still respect you as a human being and as a person. So how can I make this right? Now I understand like there's case by case basis and sometimes people are being unreasonable, but I don't think anything that we're saying here is unreasonable whatsoever. And so yeah, unless you have anything else to say on that, we can move on to the next segment. But this part again, like for me, it was just so jaw-dropping, and even for Matt Dillahunty to just go along with it. Like they praised you in different parts of their videos of saying, well, yeah, Jonathan's really well spoken, he's a really smart person, but then they accuse you of making like just like a ridiculously stupid mistake, and it's just like it's just bizarre, and it just comes across honestly as just like almost like prejudicial towards Christians, and I don't think that's what they really want to do. But that's just the way that I interpreted it. If y'all think I'm wrong, put something in the comments, whatever. But yeah, it was just bizarre.
Totally agree.
All right. Well, we'll move on to the next segment on undesigned coincidences.
As sole members of a new and unprecedented category, completely unique in all of human history. On what evidentiary basis shall we invent an entirely new historical classification? For such a bold paradigm shift, I'm sure Jonathan has something rock solid.
So one category of evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and the grounding in eyewitness testimony is a category of evidence known as undesigned coincidences, where basically you have sometimes two works by different authors intersecting in a way that would be unlikely if one of them were copied from the other or both were copied from a common source.
Ah, yes, undesigned coincidences. Jonathan's signature argument, to the extent that I knew in advance to address it in my opening.
In the past and today, Jonathan has leaned into an apologetic called undesigned coincidences, the notion that subtle hints in disparate documents are unintentionally affirming. I confess that I have been dismissive of this particular apologetic in the past, if only in part because even Christian me, found this to be straining credulity. Far from needing custom ad hoc rationalizations for each one, each example to me is clearly one or more of literary dependence, harmonizing established tradition, which may well even have historical kernels, pure speculation, or even actual coincidence.
And how do we know an undesigned coincidence from an actual coincidence?
Sure, good question. So it's a mark of casualness, I think, is a hallmark of verisimilitude. It's the casualness and artlessness.
Casualness?
You just say casualness. So casualness is the answer of how we know the difference between just people who are telling the same story in different ways versus, eyewitnesses who were there. I guess, is that what it comes down to?
So it synchronizes exactly as you would expect, given the chronology of John, and does so in such a casual and undeliberate way that actually supports the historicity of the account in this very specific detail. Again, it's the mark of casualness, and it's a mark of casualness where you have this very casual reference that's completely unconnected. So it's very, very casual and very subtle.
Ah, yes, that unassailable correlation between casualness and truthfulness and accuracy.
Keep your distance, though, Chewie, but don't look like you're trying to keep your distance. I don't know. Fly casual.
Anything else besides casualness?
But you do have very specific details that are preserved. So the identity of the disciple Jesus turned to at the feeding of the 5,000, the specific number of days before Passover Jesus entered Bethany, and so forth. That's a level of specificity which I doubt was preserved in these oral traditions that were circulating in the early years of Christianity. I don't think that the early
specificity,
we're talking about very minor and very specific detail. That level of specificity and so many examples of it that we can historically confirm.
Specificity and so many?
I mean, there's just so many of those, and they often involve very particular, minor, peripheral details that, in my judgment, the best explanation is that these actually do reflect historical details, historically true facts. And there's an inductive argument that, given that there's so many points where you can actually confirm and historically cross-check these sources.
Okay, so what should convince me that there are undesigned coincidences in the Gospels are quantity, specificity, and casualness. Three entirely subjective, qualitative, nebulous, intangible properties that are not clearly differentiated from other explanations. And based on these seemingly arbitrary measures, I should be so convinced that I'm willing to put the Gospels into a category of unassailable 100% reliability that is unique among all documents in all of history. That's Jonathan's case. I should feel a certain way. I was even willing to grant, for the sake of discussion only, that all of Jonathan's proposed undesigned coincidences could be traced back to a historical kernel. For example, Jonathan.
Okay. So we're hanging the entire argument on undesigned coincidences. I thought, that's not necessarily true. Undesigned coincidence is an important piece of evidence that we do bring to the table, that you bring to the table. I guess we are the representative groupies, as some people say, but that's not like what we're basing all of our argument. Right.
And not even in my opening statement did I base my entire argument for gospel reliability on undesigned coincidences. I actually covered multiple categories of evidence. I covered undesigned coincidences, and I also covered unexplained allusions, and I covered artless similarities, and I believe I also covered extra-biblical corroborations in brief, and I give a representative or very brief sample of each. And so he knows that I don't base my entire argument on undesigned coincidences, but as you said rightly, it is a very important piece of the evidence, and I think that the mark of casualness and specificity do suggest that the accounts that we read are historically accurate, in particular the sheer quantity or number of these undesigned coincidences. Yeah, you might be able to explain one or two or even three of these by mere coincidence or something like that. But when you're dealing with scores and scores of them, in particular, and the most impressive ones are those between Acts and letters of Paul, because there's an abundance of evidence that Luke and Acts are actually, Acts and the epistles of Paul are independent of one another, and that one is not basing their writing on the other, and so that makes the case even stronger than it is in the Gospels. Although the case in the Gospels is very strong as well. When you look at, for example, at the day, the timestamp that's given to us in John as to when Jesus entered Bethany, which is 6 days before the Passover in John 12, and how in verse 12 of John 12 it mentions that the following day he rises to Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, and then so we get timestamp which is unique to John of entering Jerusalem as 5 days before Passover, and then you go over to Mark chapter 11. We find that the account is telescoped or condensed relative to John. He doesn't mention that Jesus actually arrived in Bethany the night before, and it wasn't until the morning that he sent the disciples to fetch the colts. And then you can actually start counting off the days in Mark, even though Mark doesn't give us that same timestamp. It's very, very casual, and it doesn't look like John most certainly came later after the Gospel of Mark. It doesn't look like John is creating those details in John to fit with the account in Mark. And furthermore, in the case of a lot of these, you actually have minor variations or discrepancies between the accounts. So, for example, in the case of that particular one, you have in Mark 14, you have the anointing at Bethany, which takes place after the triumphal entry, whereas in John, the anointing appears to take place prior to the triumphal entry in John 12. And so that would be, in my opinion, a strong candidate for an actual error. It does look like either Mark or John made a chronological slip, and this can be very readily explained by variation in eyewitness memory. Or another example relating to the feeding of the 5,000 that we've spoken about, and I mentioned in the debate, I think, where so in Mark 6, so we know that in Luke 9 verse 10 it mentions that the event took place at Bethsaida, whereas Mark 6 actually mentions that following the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus has the disciples get into a boat and head over to the other side towards Bethsaida. Well, how does that fit together, given that Luke's setting is in Bethsaida, whereas Mark appears to have them get into a boat and go towards Bethsaida? And so it looks like these accounts are actually independent. The way that I personally, there's a few different ways of harmonizing that. The way that I approach that particular example is to suppose, because if you look carefully at the text in Mark 6, we learn that they actually land in Gennesaret, not in Bethsaida. And we have a few different undesigned coincidences that confirm that the event in fact took place in Bethsaida. And so the explanation that I think personally is the most plausible is that you could either say that they were that to take Bethsaida as speaking in terms of a geographical region, like I might say I'm from Boston, even though I'm actually technically I live in Malden, or and they would be sailing past Bethsaida on their way to the other side. That's one way of interpreting it. Another way of interpreting it, which is the one that I lean towards, is that Mark's source simply misspoke a single word, which is very easy to do. I do it all the time in my own public presentations, and that's such a minor, trivial error that it doesn't really affect the substantial reliability of the account. But nonetheless, it does establish or point, I think, quite forcefully towards the conclusion of independence, and that thereby bolsters the case for undesigned coincidences.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of people, this is where they get kind of confused. They have a comment here again from Hats Off. He says that he was puzzled by, we're not pummeling Hats Off, he's just puzzled by what Dr. McClatchy means by casualness. And so I might interject, and if you want to throw in any kind of clarification, if you would, but like take the example of the undesigned coincidence with Philip and the feeding of the 5,000, right? And so John casually mentions in chapter 1 and later on in chapter 12 that Philip happens to be from Bethsaida. He never identifies where the feeding of the 5,000 happened in John chapter 6, where it's recorded, right? But he does mention that Jesus happened to turn to Philip and asked him, hey, Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people can eat? And the question is just asked. It's not like highlighting like Philip is from Bethsaida and the feeding of the 5,000 is from Bethsaida. It's just kind of a question that's out of the blue. And if we were inventing a gospel story, I don't think we'd probably insert Philip there, right? I mean, he's such a minor character, right? And so, but Luke, when we go over to Luke's gospel, it mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 happens in Bethsaida, and he just mentions it in this casual, kind of subtle way. He just mentions it in passing, right? He's not trying to explain. John is not trying to explain a detail in Luke, right? And obviously, Luke is not trying to explain a detail in John, but he just mentions it in passing. But these things dovetail in such a way, in this like really artless kind of way, and that's like where the casualness comes from. Now, when they match up in these ways, it's like a good sign that they're reliable sources. And what Paulogia is trying to say is that the Gospels are like the telephone game. And what I thought was really interesting too was in one of his videos, and I happened to respond to this video, is like, and he mentions it in this clip that we just played, is he's willing to concede that it goes back to like a historical kernel. Well, if you think about it, like, you know, like there's these oral sources or whatever, these stories that passed on. There was something that happened in Bethsaida, and there was a question that was asked to Philip. And for some reason, these oral sources like really, really hung on to that, right? And there's this kernel of like information that somehow survived. But yet, like all of a sudden, they're real fuzzy on the, you know, like the other details, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so, like, oh yeah, that through the oral tradition, they really, really, really remembered a question that Jesus asked to Philip, and they really, really, really remembered like that the feeding of the 5,000 just happened to happen in Bethsaida, or you know that it was Passover and the grass was green, as Mark and John kind of fill in each other with undesigned coincidences there. And so I hope that kind of clarifies a little bit, because what we're saying is these details aren't just like purposefully put in there to explain the other gospel. They're just dropped in there like normal people talking about what they witnessed. And that's where the casualness comes from. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Jonathan?
No, you absolutely nailed it. That's what I mean. Casualness, by the way, was the phrase that was used by William Paley. This is actually the 1795 first printing of Paley's view of the evidence of Christianity. He actually used that term, casualness, to describe the phenomenon that you're describing, that it really doesn't look like the gospel authors are including those details to try and explain or clarify casual references made in the other gospels. Rather, they fit together in a very artless and undesigned way. And so, for example, when Mark in Mark 6:31, he mentions the coming and going crowds in verse 31 as the motivation for why Jesus has the disciples come away to a deserted area to eat. It's a very casual reference. And in verse 39, he mentions that Jesus has the crowds sitting groups on the green grass. And then in John 6, verse 4, it mentions that the Jewish Passover feast was at hand. It just mentions that as just to set the scene for when the event is taking place, which happens to dovetail in an undesigned and artless way with what you see in Mark, because it explains why it's so busy, and it explains the motivation for coming into the deserted area to eat, according to Mark, because it's the Passover feast, according to John, because there's all these Jewish pilgrims coming in for the feast of Passover, and it also illuminates why in verse 39 the grass is green. Very subtle and casual detail that is explained and illuminated by John. So that suggests that we're dealing here with historical reportage. And when you consider that there are scores and scores of those across the gospel sources, it really seems to point towards the historical reportage model as being the best way to understand these sources.
Yeah. And what was the other thing that he said was just kind of this nebulous? I mean, I think it has to do with the fact that it's a cumulative case that you mentioned earlier. We're not just mentioning like, okay, well, there's a couple of undesigned coincidences, because again, that could be statistical noise. Yeah, he had the picture of Captain Kirk with the whatever the furry things that were flying at him, but that's kind of the point, right? I mean, when even on his slide, when he was mentioning undesigned coincidences, I just thought it was so interesting. He was like, well, they could be explained by literary dependence, or some of them could be explained by historical kernel, or some of them can be explained, well, you know, just sheer coincidence themselves. And for everything else, you know, it's, you know, the others can be explained by just speculation. You're just seeing things. They're undesigned coincidences that aren't there. And what we're trying to say is the cumulative amount of these undesigned coincidences. When you got to say, hey, literary dependence for X number of events and historical kernel for like Y set of events. And when those don't fit, we'll just say it's speculation. And when speculation doesn't fit and everything else doesn't fit, we're just going to say, it's all a coincidence. That's the definition of being ad hoc, right?
Right. Yeah. You have to scotch tape together a lot of ad hoc auxiliary hypotheses to make the data fit. And as I said earlier, you can do that if you want, in the same way that you can do that for young Earth creationism. But that doesn't make it plausible, because you have to scotch tape together so many different explanations to make the data fit, when you could just explain all of the evidence with one single hypothesis, which is, in this case, that the Gospels are actually giving us reliable historical reportage about the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and Acts is giving us a reliable report of the life and doings of and ministry of the Apostle Paul.
Yeah. So, and I just feel like this is so often misunderstood. So hopefully I'll try and put a link in the show notes, because I did like a 30-minute video responding to undesigned coincidences, point by point by point by point. And so I go over a lot of this in more detail. And of course, Dr. McClatchy, you have multiple blog posts where you respond to lots of different objections from Richard Carrier. I'm trying to remember the other.
John Nelson, Kurt
Jaros. Yep. And so definitely check those out, because again, this casualness thing is misunderstood. And I don't know what it is about undesigned coincidences. Maybe it's just because it's different, maybe because it's old and people just kind of have this idea, well, if it's old, it must be debunked or something like that. But the argument itself was never debunked. It just fell out of fashion, I guess. Now, what would you say to somebody who says about the literary dependence? There was a comment in the stream. I can't pull it up right now because I can't find it. But with the whole literary dependence, isn't that like a defeater? Obviously, we know that Mark probably came first and Matthew and Luke borrowed Mark. Why is that not a defeater for undesigned coincidences?
No, as we've just mentioned, because of the casualness of the accounts. It doesn't look like John is trying to just explain Luke or Mark. It looks like it's the mark of casualness that is a hallmark of verisimilitude, and so you can make the case stronger if you do demonstrate independence. So that's why I think that the case for Acts from undesigned coincidences is even stronger than that for the Gospels, because you actually have a really good arguments that Acts and the letters of Paul are independent of one another. But that doesn't mean that it's of no evidential value when there is some literary dependence, because and this is also, by the way, a very this is also relates to another item of, or another example of faulty epistemology when it comes to gospel scholarship, because people often in New Testament scholarship will draw this false dichotomy between dependence and independence. And there's actually a third category, which is partial dependence and partial independence. And so the gospel authors can actually be partially dependent upon one another, but have their own independent access to the historical events in question. And so they can actually supply additional information that is, and when Matthew or Luke supply information that's not found in Mark, that doesn't mean that they're just making stuff up. It may well be that they actually have their own independent access to the facts themselves. So in the case, for example, of Matthew 14, where it mentions in verse 1 and 2, Herod's conversation with his servants about Jesus, saying this is John the Baptist, he's been raised from the dead, that's why these miraculous powers are working him. He's actually dependent partially on Mark 6 here, which has the parallel account in Mark. But Matthew uniquely adds the phrase to his servants, which is not found in Mark, but it dovetails neatly with what you find in Luke 8, verse 3, which lists as one of Jesus' female disciples that followed him from Galilee, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And so one of Jesus' female disciples is married to someone who interacts with Herod's employment. So even though Matthew was partially dependent upon Mark, it looks like that phrase to his servants betrays his additional independent access to the facts that comes from some other source besides Mark, and perhaps even his own memory and recollection.
Yeah, it's obvious that Luke is not like reading Matthew and going, oh man, I got to explain this fact, but I'm going to put it in here completely like undetached, just like about Joanna and all this other stuff, and I'm not even going to mention anything about that. And I even mentioned, Luke is even going to mention later the whole scene again, but it's completely removed from that. And there's also, I think, reasons to think that Luke probably didn't use Matthew, although there are people who discuss that. But I'm not sure really where I'm at with that. But it's just so obvious again that that's not what's happening here. And so I feel like, again, there's just a lot of confusion around this particular topic. And I feel like it's because, in my opinion, and I'm not just talking about Paul here, I'm talking about some of the others that we've talked to, that you've responded to. There's just like this debunk first mentality that the Gospels could possibly be reportage. And so if scholars don't like this argument, well, they don't need to talk about this argument. Most of them aren't even aware of it. Even when Bart Ehrman debated Tim McGrew on the particular topic, he didn't come prepared really at all to deal with it. And so I don't know. There's just too much dismissiveness of it. So I would definitely highly recommend people look further into the argument, and again, really try and understand kind of where we're coming from with it.
Also notice that a lot of the undesigned coincidences are between John and the synoptics as well. And so John isn't part of the synoptic problem or the synoptic puzzle. John is largely independent of the synoptics, although it's quite plausible that he had read the synoptics and was familiar with them. So, but he's not dependent upon them in the same way that Matthew and Luke seem to be dependent upon Mark. There isn't the same sort of literary relationship there. And so I think the synoptic problem doesn't really relate so much to the undesigned coincidences that are between John and the synoptic gospels. So, for example, I mentioned in the debate the undesigned coincidence between John 13 and Luke 22 concerning the Last Supper, where Jesus washed the disciples' feet, which is given to us in John 13. But Luke 22 specifically mentions the occasion that gave rise to the object lesson of servanthood, but Luke doesn't mention the object lesson itself of washing the disciples' feet. He mentions that there was a debate over supper among the disciples over who was the greatest, and Jesus says, who is the greatest among you, one who reclines at table or one who serves? It's not the one who reclines at table, but I'm among you as the one who serves. And then John doesn't mention the debate among the disciples over dinner over who's the greatest, but does tell us about the object lesson in servanthood. And so the accounts fit together in just the sort of way that you might expect. And it doesn't look like John is inserting that detail to explain Luke. It looks like these are independent of one another. And and as I mentioned before, you also have minor discrepancies between the accounts, which in many cases can be harmonized, but nonetheless point to the independence of these accounts.
Yeah, if you're carefully poring over Mark or whatever, if you're John, you're not going to just like create questions and all these other things, right? You're going to try and sync things up as much as you possibly can and not create a discrepancy. So, yeah, there's so much we could say about this, but we probably should move on. But again, I just highly recommend read, slow down, get into the argument, because the more people try to debunk this argument, it's just the more my confidence grows into it, because it just seems like it just kind of trips people's mental trigger, and they start saying things that just like don't make sense to me. But anyway, we'll talk about harmonization now.
Jonathan had one more complaint about how historians do history.
I mean, a similar thing in scholarship that I often strongly disagree with is the disdain for harmonization, which I think is a very good historical practice. And so regardless of whether scholars like to harmonize, I think they should like to harmonize.
In apologetics, harmonization is coming up with hypothetical explanations for contradictions, or what they would call apparent contradictions, in the Gospels, or biblical passages in general.
In episode BF12, you were battling barbarians while riding a winged Appaloosa. Yet in the very next scene, my dear, you're clearly atop a winged Arabian. Please to explain it.
Yeah. Well, whenever you notice something like that, a wizard did it.
Jonathan wants to take both confirming details and disconfirming details as affirmation of authentic historical reportage.
And so that also, I think, strengthens the case for undesigned coincidences when you have these minor discrepancies between the accounts.
It's kind of a heads you win, tails you lose thing. Both.
All right, Joe, you remember the rules. Heads I win, tails you lose.
Just flip.
Tails!
Damn it!
Both discrepancies and differences, both discrepancies and collaboration are both evidence, it seems like.
Ineffectualness of the minimal.
Okay. So he's basically saying that like everything counts as evidence for the apologist, even discrepancies. And so is that what we're saying, Jonathan?
No. So as I said before, firstly, I think the vast majority of discrepancies can be harmonized quite readily without strain or artificialness. And this is what I call a reconcilable variation, which actually supports independence of the account. So an example of this is in the Synoptic Gospels, we find that there are various women that discover the tomb empty on Easter morning, and the identity of those women varies a little bit, but it's not particularly problematic because Luke 24 is very explicit that he's not giving as an exhaustive list. He says the other women with them. But it becomes more interesting when we compare the synoptics with John chapter 20, verse 1, where it says that on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. And so it looks like, if you read just verse 1 of John 20, that Mary Magdalene alone went to the tomb early on Easter morning. We can even push the objection a bit further, though, because in Matthew chapter 28, we read that various women with Mary Magdalene listed as being present discover the empty tomb and then have an encounter with an angel and then with Jesus. Whereas in John 20, verse 2, we learn that Mary Magdalene runs back to Peter and John and apparently doesn't know what's happened to the body of Jesus. And so how are we to harmonize that with the fact that, according to Matthew, the women, and Mary Magdalene's listed as being present there, already had an encounter, not just with an angel, but with Jesus himself. And what the harmonization, I think, that one would be forced to, if one supposes that these accounts are harmonizable, is that Mary must have left the group of women prior to their encounter with the angel and with Jesus in Matthew 28. And this is precisely what is suggested by a close reading of John 20, verse 2, where it says that she ran to Simon Peter, and the disciple whom Jesus loved, and she said to them, "They've taken the Lord from the tomb, and we do not know." Udamen. The verb udamen is plural, where they have laid him. And so the use of the plural verb there indicates that there were, in fact, or implies that there were, in fact, a larger group that she is representing. We do not know where they have laid him. And so that dovetails exactly as you would expect on the historical reportage model with Matthew. And so that suggests that these are, in fact, independent of one another and actually provides positive support for the trustworthiness of these accounts. And this is what we call a reconcilable variation. That term was coined by the Reverend T.R. Burks. And Lydia has also written on this subject as well. She has a chapter on it in her new book, Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels, which I highly recommend. And even in the cases where they are more difficult to harmonize, or even those cases where there is a strong case that can be made for a minor good faith mistake, I would argue that they carry that they have multiple epistemic vectors. That is to say that it is somewhat negatively relevant to our assessment of the reliability of these sources, but there's an epistemic asymmetry such that the cases of confirmation are much stronger in confirming the reliability of the accounts than the alleged discrepancies and contradictions and so forth are in disconfirming the reliability of these sources. And here's why: because there's far more ways that we might be missing a piece of crucial information that might harmonize the accounts, or in which a minor good faith error might have been incorporated into the text, than there are ways that the points of confirmation might have arisen on the hypothesis of fictitious reportage. And so there's an epistemic asymmetry here. And when we calibrate our expectations by looking at other works of ancient history, and indeed modern history, we discover that minor discrepancies of this sort is not at all uncommon. And so given that eyewitness testimony, even reliable eyewitness testimony, predicts that you'll find some minor discrepancies, and that's in fact what you find, it can't then be taken as a serious objection to the substantial or even strong reliability of these sources, unless you can show that the errors or contradictions are significantly major or are so numerous that it overwhelms the positive case, which one could, of course, do in principle. I just don't think that's the case with the Gospels. But as I said, it has multiple epistemic vectors, because even the strong cases of discrepancy, by that I mean those where there's a strong argument for it actually being a discrepancy, those, even though they are slightly relevant in a negative way to the reliability, to our assessment of the reliability of these sources, they do also increase the probability of independence and thereby bolster the argument for historicity also on the major events described, and also, of course, bolster the case from undesigned coincidences by providing further support for the independence of the accounts.
Right. It's not as if if the Gospels did contain like really bad historical errors or really bad contradictions, and it could be shown that they can't be trusted. I mean, that's the whole point of like skeptics like Bart Ehrman's arguments, right? And so basically, lost my train of thought a little bit there, but basically we're not saying like, well, the Gospels are special, you know, that they're immune to this kind of criticism. No, we're saying that if you can show that, then go ahead and show it. But we're talking about either good faith errors that are easily explained and wouldn't do away with them being eyewitness testimony, or we're talking about things that are just easily reconciled, because when it comes to eyewitness testimony, we expect there to be discrepancy. We expect there to be issues, and historians harmonize accounts when there's multiple accounts of the same story and there's discrepancies. They look to ways to say, okay, well, this is a possibility of how these things can fit. And so it's not, I think people just think that this is a special Christian thing that we're doing. And like, we wouldn't do this with other accounts, but like, that's just absolutely not the case.
When you have multiple accounts that bear on an event, why not allow the accounts to clarify and illuminate one another, especially when the accounts in question have been shown to have a very strong track record of accurate reportage? And when there seems to be a discrepancy between the accounts, I think it's quite reasonable for an historian to use real world imagination to determine whether there's a plausible way in which the accounts in fact fit together after all. And so that's what we do when we engage in harmonization. And as I said in the discussion with Paulogia, I think that regardless of whether, regardless of whether historians like the practice of harmonization, they should like to harmonize. I strongly disagree with the disdain that many New Testament scholars have for the practice of harmonization. And I think that unfortunately it is another instance of bad epistemology within our discipline.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, a lot of times they're creating like contradictions even where there are none. I mean, you know, you have like silly things like the Matthew and his two donkeys or something like that people want to make a big deal of. I mean, you know, it says that there was the colt and the foal and they sat their cloaks on them and he sat on them, and oh, look how stupid Matthew is. You know, he's obviously Jesus straddling two donkeys. Gotcha. And it's just like, okay, come on, like use a little common sense and like a shred of charity, and you could just think about the way people talk, you know. And so there's a tendency, I think, with New Testament scholarship to kind of go the other way, that there's just like, well, you know, we have to let Mark just be Mark. And so, you know, you can't harmonize them. Like Bart Ehrman will say, well, you're creating your own gospel. And we're not creating our own gospel. We're just saying, hey, this is a possibility. The Gospels are shown themselves to be trustworthy in many, many other ways. And so this is just lets the accounts, like you said, illuminate one illuminating the other. And this is just what we do with normal history. So now we got martyrdom coming up here. We're getting there.
Facts approach, Jonathan and I also issue some arguments from apostle martyrdom.
And so Christians were persecuted fiercely under the Emperor Nero from 64 AD onwards. And Peter and Paul, as you rightly said, seem to have got caught up in that persecution. And it seems that Nero's motivations for persecuting the Christians was not so much theological precision, but rather it was political. He needed a scapegoat. So I do think that does reduce the evidential value of the specific fact that they're martyred. There's no reason at all, in fact, some reason to think otherwise, that the apostles that were persecuted under Nero, Peter, Paul, etc., were given no opportunity to recant. There's reason to think that they probably weren't given opportunity to recant, and no reason to think that there is. So we agree there.
So on what does he rest his case for eyewitness sincerity?
That the early apostles were willing to voluntarily undergo and endure sufferings, hardships, imprisonments, dangers, and so forth on account of their testimony. And that goes a long way towards establishing, it doesn't prove, but it goes a long way towards establishing that they were at least sincere. And we have good reason to think that the book of Acts is substantially trustworthy, as it was written by a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So it's the general context of danger and persecution and imprisonments and so forth that I would appeal to, more so than the specific martyrdom of any one apostle.
We can't pinpoint eyewitnesses putting their lives in danger, but Jonathan appeals to a general context of danger. Perhaps this general context is casual, specific, and plentiful.
Luke, Acts,
okay, so the evidence is entirely in Acts.
Correct.
Entirely in a single document within the New Testament? It's time to break out.
I'm not making a circular argument that the resurrection account is reliable, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, the resurrection account is reliable, Jesus rose from the dead. And Dale Allison, as you know, in his book on the resurrection, charges the maximal data theorists like myself with that sort of begging the question fallacy.
Jonathan, like all others before him, fails to convince me that there were eyewitnesses out there proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus within the context of persecution. I'm supposed to just assume this was the case.
As far as I can tell in the book of Acts, after around chapter 4, the apostles, the 12 disciples, the 12 people, and even if you include Matthias, right, they kind of disappear from Acts, save for Peter and John. Would you agree?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. So you're not making, I assume you're not saying that any of those are ones that you would name by name to say, well, that person was willing to suffer and die, right? Because we don't know what happened to them.
So, as I said before, the nuanced argument I'm going to make for martyrdom is to do with the general context of persecution. We can't give specific examples. I mentioned
but I just even willing to die. Like, I don't know that Bartholomew did anything after chapter 4.
But the early apostles who wrote the gospel authors who relayed the stories or the ones from whom the stories came concerning the resurrection, they certainly were proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus, and they were willing to be persecuted on account of that.
So we're back to the huge elephant in the room. Were the gospel authors eyewitnesses to anything?
I guess I was wanting to know what this willing to die adds. Like, let's say I'm already on board. If I'm already on board with these are reliable documents, do I actually even need the willing to die argument? Doesn't seem like I do. I have a jingle for that, but that's all right.
What?
All right. So, yeah, the argument for martyrdom and our favorite jingle. So, I've stolen the jingle, Paul. If you're watching, I don't know if you are. I've used the jingle in a couple videos, so thank you for providing the green screen jingle. But anyways, Jonathan, your thoughts on that clip there?
Yeah, again, he seemed to misunderstand the point that is being made. So he says, why do we need the argument from apostolic martyrdom if we already have established that the gospel accounts are reliable? And he's misunderstanding the argument. And this is the same misunderstanding that Dale Allison has in his book on the resurrection. We're not saying the gospel accounts are very reliable and the resurrection accounts are in the gospels, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. That's not the argument. Rather, the argument is that the gospels can be shown to be composed by individuals who are well informed, close up to the facts, and in the habit of being scrupulous and truthful. And that being the case, and that's established very firmly, in my judgment, by numerous lines of evidence: undesigned coincidences, artless similarities, unexplained allusions, extra biblical confirmations, and so forth. That being the case, we have to give an explanation for why the witnesses claimed what they did. So the argument is not that, therefore, the resurrection accounts are reliable. Rather, the argument is this is what the witnesses claimed happened. And so then we have to give an explanation for why they made the sorts of claims that they did. Is it that Jesus rose from the dead? Are they honestly mistaken? Or did they lie about it? And we've already run through that trilemma and concluded that the best explanation is, in fact, that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, as for the point about, we don't know what happened to most of the disciples. Okay, fair point. We do have evidence in Acts for Peter and John proclaiming the gospel and suffering persecution as a result of that. We also have evidence in Acts for James, the son of Zebedee, dying as a martyr. He was beheaded by Herod Agrippa I in Acts 12. We have evidence for the general context of persecution also. And of course, who would be the chief targets of a general persecution? The leaders of the Christian movement, which included the apostles. And as I said in the discussion, the sources from whom the resurrection accounts came did apparently deliver those accounts in the context of persecution. And that goes a long way towards establishing the sincerity of the apostles in their contention that Jesus rose from the dead. And so that's the way that I would structure the argument. There's, of course, other arguments as well that also support the resurrection claim. The use of women, for example, also supports sincerity because people who are lying about the resurrection are unlikely to invent females as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. If you were making stuff up for apologetic purposes, you'd be more likely to invent male witnesses. Of course, that's not an ironclad argument, but it does tend to move the needle in the direction of sincerity. and it's more probable that that observation would be made on the hypothesis of the disciples being sincere than it otherwise would have been. You've also furthermore got the why even use women at all? Why involve the women at all, given that you're involving additional conspirators who could potentially undermine or contradict the resurrection claim? There is a matter of getting these 5 or minimum 5 women unnecessarily involved and inducing them to say that they were the first to see Jesus risen and they saw angels, and then counting on them to keep up their side of the story. Of course, in that social context, it's not as though their stories are especially likely to carry conviction, and nor were their stories necessary for such a conspiracy, and involving them only added to the risk of discovery, as due to the additional numbers of conspirators, and also due to other social influences on the women, such as male figures in their lives, husbands, fathers, etc., who would be outside of the apostles' control. And so that also, I think, argues against the hypothesis that of some sort of conspiracy. You might also point out the disciples' change of heart. So Peter, as you know, denies the Lord 3 times to save his own skin. So fearful is he of crucifixion, and yet. Given that behavior on Thursday evening, why would he suddenly change his mind by Saturday night and decide to start this hoax that involved this lifelong continued association with Jesus' name, which went against his own self-interests and put him in a context of danger, and he was imprisoned, beaten, ultimately executed. And we have good sources for the execution of the Apostle Paul. Clement of Rome in the 1st century, for example, notes it in his letter to the Corinthian Christians. Most scholars date it around AD 96. John 21 also mentions, anticipates Peter's death, because Jesus mentions it in John if he was written towards the end of the 1st century, which is the consensus view of modern scholars, and also the early church view that John wrote it when he was late in years. It seems most likely that had already happened by the time of his writing, because John specifies that Jesus said this to show the sort of death that Peter was going to die, and so that also provides corroboration. And so when you consider all of these different factors in aggregate, it seems much more likely that the apostles were sincere than otherwise. So that would be my response there.
Yep, I really don't have anything to add. On top of that, so yeah, I think you pretty much hit any kind of points that I probably would have hit. You hit them. So we'll move on to our old friend David Hume. He came up in the debate.
What do you guys think about returning to the Hume question and then doing some Q&A?
Yeah, let's talk about Hume. So there's a number of problems I have with Hume. One of the biggest ones is that so David Hume isn't necessarily saying that miracles don't happen and ruling it out a priori. Rather, he's saying that even if a miracle did occur, you can't justifiably come to the conclusion that a miracle has occurred in history, because a miracle, by its very nature, is the least probable explanation, because otherwise it wouldn't be a miracle. That's the very nature of the case.
Right. That was my last slide, actually. I didn't read it out loud, but that was actually the basis of my last slide on my presentation, so we can go back.
I'll read it now. By the way, historical evidence for resurrection is insufficient to conclude the resurrection is true, even if it is actually true. Jonathan then appealed to theological reasons why miracles would be rare events, but that misses the point of my appeal to Hume.
Given that we have independent reasons to think Christianity is true, that in turn informs our assessment of the prior probability of God performing a miracle in Jesus' case specifically.
And of course, that prior probability, that assumption hasn't been made on my part, so my prior probability is definitely different than yours. But I still don't get how in any miracle claim, be it a miracle claim from yesterday or a miracle claim from thousands of years ago, that I can put that it actually happened ahead of someone is mistaken or someone is lying. Because on every single day, millions of people are mistaken, millions of people lie, but on any given day, there can't be millions of miracles. There's probably only a few miracles. So I cannot see how that can ever become more likely than those two things that are mundane.
So your frequentist approach is, I think, inappropriate for the reason that I've already given, that it's highly predicted on the hypothesis that miracles are not going to be a very common occurrence. They're going to recognizably deviate from the way nature normally behaves. And so the fact that you observe that, given that it's so highly expected on the hypothesis, can't be a significant objection to the hypothesis in question.
But the evidence given for these miracles is the exact same kind of evidence that would be given for someone sincerely mistaken. The sincerely mistaken person is going to leave the exact same kind of testimony, indistinguishable from that the miracle actually happened.
I'm not advocating that miracle claims are rejected a priori. My concern is the sufficiency of evidence provided to corroborate the proposition.
I should clarify the thing I said before was only when testimony is the major source of the witness. I would agree that a miracle claim from yesterday, if there was medical documentation, all that kind of thing, that could absolutely raise this significance. So I do want to just, lest anyone accuse me of anything weird there, I do mean when it's based on testimony alone.
In Inquiries, Hume says that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish.
I guess we're just saying, even if that miracle happened, it doesn't seem like testimony could ever be relied on. You're talking about subtleness of testimony. I just can't come with you, I guess, that there's a type of testimony that ever will seem more likely than someone being sincerely mistaken.
But that's just mathematically false, right? Because if testimony conveys some evidential value in confirming a particular proposition, then there has to be a certain level of testimony in terms of quantity and quality that will overcome the initial intrinsically low prior probability of the miracle itself.
I don't know. This is a worldview difference that you and I have that I'm not sure will be overcome here.
Which brings us to one.
All right. So our good old buddy David Hume. And so it just seems to me, I don't know, that he says in principle that enough evidence could overcome his low prior, that he's probably setting the prior pretty low. But then it's like he kind of goes back and forth, it seems like a little bit to me, to where it's like no testimony really could, but maybe it could, but you don't got it. And I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding. I don't want to mischaracterize Paul at all. But it just seemed like he was kind of going back and forth. And with Hume's quote, we're kind of like that particular quote. Hume himself goes back and forth in his own essay. But that's what we're kind of saying is, okay, game on. We do have that kind of evidence to where, you're not going to be able to explain it away. The miracle hypothesis is going to be the better hypothesis. You're not going to be able to explain it without great implausibility on the assumption that it didn't happen. And so that itself is evidence for a miracle. And so I don't know, Jonathan, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're not denying that you need more evidence to establish a miracle occurred than simply a mundane claim. But if we, I would argue that we do have very compelling evidence for the resurrection, and I'd also argue that the prior probability or the intrinsic plausibility of the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is not as low as many skeptics contend it to be. I actually think that it's reasonably high because we have independent lines of evidence that bear on the truth of Christianity and indeed the existence of the God of Israel. The frequentist approach that Paulogia adopts to establishing the prior, and this of course also is Hume's approach to establishing the prior, and it's Bart Ehrman's approach as well, isn't a legitimate one. To claim that miracles are so infrequent and therefore the intrinsic plausibility of God performing a miracle in Jesus' case is astronomically small, or to argue that since it deviates from the normal course of nature or violates the laws of nature, even though it's not quite the way that I would define a miracle, because I don't think that miracles do violate the laws of nature. I think that laws of nature only describe the way that nature normally behaves when left to itself. But the argument is that since it violates natural law, or since it deviates from the normal course of nature, that therefore you cannot establish it as being credible on the basis of testimony alone. And I find that to be not the most appropriate way of approaching the prior probability. I am, for the reason that I gave, that the hypothesis under review, which is that God has wrought miracles in history as authenticating signs to vindicate a divine messenger, that strongly predicts that miracles are going to deviate from the normal course of nature, because if they didn't, they would be robbed of their evidential value in confirming a divine messenger. It wouldn't grab our attention in the same way if 1 in every 10 million people rose from the dead, because if Jesus then rose from the dead, we'd think, well, he must be one of those lucky 1 in 10 million people. But because it recognizes the deviation from the normal course of nature, therefore it has evidential value. And so given that that strong prediction that it does deviate from the normal course of nature, the fact that we observe it does in fact so deviate can't then be taken as a strong defeater for the hypothesis that God has wrought miracles as authenticating signs. So there are better ways of approaching the prior, and I would argue that independent lines of evidence that bear on Jesus' divine and messianic identity and the existence of the God of Israel are positively relevant to the prior, such as I mentioned before, the trilemma argument, the effort of C.S. Lewis, the conversion of Paul, the argument from messianic prophecy, the argument from contemporary miracles, and survival of the nation of Israel against all odds. And these suggest that God plausibly has motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead, and therefore the resurrection hypothesis ought to be on the table for consideration as we review the different candidate explanations.
Right. I mean, if there's a possibility that there's an afterlife and there's a possibility that God exists, then one of the ways that he's would necessarily have to reveal himself, I don't see how else he could do it unless he just wants to give everybody a mass experience all at once, would be through miracles. If he's going to make a revelation known, that's going to be how he's going to have to do it. And so if those things are possibly true, then I would just say that, like, that's the way that he's going to have to make it known. And if there's other reasons to think that God does exist, the miracles aren't really improbable. They're probable in the sense that they're going to happen at some point in history. And you make a good point too. Obviously, you can't use the laws of nature and pit the laws of nature against miracles, because they would never stand out without miracles. Just like your hat there, which we might as well touch on that now. You're not going to put a blue font that says "Talk About Doubts" on your blue hat. Like, that would be like a really bad way for people to see what's going on there. It would just be a fully blue hat. And so God doesn't use like a black pen on a black background. He's going to do something that stands out. So we might as well touch on that right now. Talkaboutdoubts.com is a ministry that you work with, Jonathan, or it's the ministry that you founded. Tell us a little bit about it. I know you've been on the show before, but for those who might not know, just tell us, what you do with that.
Sure. So talkaboutdoubts.com I founded in December of 2021, and we've been going a bit over a year now. And basically we offer a service whereby we mentor privately Christians who are struggling with doubts about faith, as well as ex-Christians who want to explore whether there's a rational road back to faith. We're not an informal debate society, so if you're just looking for a free argument, then that's not what we're about. But if you are genuinely struggling with doubts, or you want to explore whether there might be a rational way back to faith, then we'd love to hear from you and set up a one-on-one or perhaps two-on-one private Zoom call to talk with you about your doubts and confidence. We have some of the world's top scholars in different subjects: philosophy, New Testament scholarship, Old Testament scholarship, biblical archaeology, textual criticism, philosophy, physics, biology, geology. We have pastors, we have psychologists. So whatever area that you're struggling with in regards to doubt, we can pair you with some of the world's leading lights on these subjects, and we can have a conversation and explore together the evidence for Christianity and work through your concerns in confidence.
Yeah, and you do have a YouTube channel on there as well, where you share, there's testimonies from past inquirers, and there's just been a lot of really good fruit that's come out of it. And you also have some teaching courses that you have uploaded there they're uploaded there as well, that I think is just a tremendously helpful resource. If somebody really wants to understand the maximal data case, and you maybe don't want to shell out, $50 to $100 on books or different things like that, they could at least get a really good primer going through all of your different teaching courses that I think are just, like I said, a really great resource. So we are going to finish up here. We got one more clip, and this is where Paulogia's partner, Shannon Q, jumps on. And so we'll go ahead and play that now.
One last moment I thought would be worth addressing regarding miracles that came up in the Q&A.
So this one's from Testify. Capturing Christianity. Does Jonathan have a few good examples of modern miracle reports?
But yeah, there are plenty of examples. One example that comes to mind, for instance, is Barbara Snyder's case of healing from multiple sclerosis when she was completely paralyzed and blind, and her feet had curled up and so forth. And there was this is discussed in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Miracles. At the time of the publication of Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Miracles, this she'd been persistently healed of MS for more than 35 years. And so it seems that her multiple sclerosis was too far advanced for it to be plausibly the result of relapsing remission MS, and given the fact that it's endured for 35 years, that seems to undermine that hypothesis as well. And then also given the fact that it took place in the context of prayer.
So somewhere my partner Shannon Q is screaming about that example from multiple sclerosis, as my partner Shannon Q has multiple sclerosis, and I looked into that one quite a lot.
Yeah, no, Paul was absolutely right. I was and am currently somewhere kind of freaking out about this a little bit by just a sheer coincidence. Moments before I sat down to record this, I lost a portion of my visual field. That's just a thing that happens to you sometimes when you have multiple sclerosis. You lose the ability to do things that other people take for granted, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, and you will just never know until the time comes. That's one of the reasons why this is so exceptionally frustrating to me. Not only because Barbara's story is one that I don't personally buy into, but because it's so frequently weaponized. When I looked into her story initially, I didn't look into it because I was interested. I looked into it because I'd been under a barrage of people, some with and some without the best of intentions, who had sent me her story because they thought it would give me hope. I looked into the story and it seemed sort of tenuous at best. Most of the people that are still purporting that this story is true seem to gain some sort of financial benefit from continuing to do so. And a lot of the facts didn't particularly seem to line up for me. Now, that's not to say that maybe it didn't happen. Maybe some sort of miraculous event took place and Barbara was miraculously healed. That's not the point, though. The point is when you use this type of story with somebody like me, functionally what you're saying is if you were more pious, God would make you better, but you're choosing not to be pious, so God won't. Now just imagine momentarily that you are a Christian who believes this story, who believes that of the millions and millions of us who are currently walking the earth with multiple sclerosis, God chose just Barbara, not the rest of us, not the rest of us who are pious even, just Barbara, to demonstrate what? That he will randomly select a person, just one, to rid this disease from? Why not all of us? Why not even just a little bit more of us? When you send something like this to someone like me, you're functionally saying that you could change the state of affairs of your physiology, something that's beyond your control, something that God would have known was in the plan for you by simply acting different or believing different than you currently do. And I know people maybe have the best of intentions and they think to themselves, well, this woman had hope. Maybe I'm giving you hope, but you're not. You're just saying that somebody had something special happen to them that wasn't you. I can't for the life of me determine why it is that people's humanity allows them to do something like that. Even if Barbara's case was true, I of course would think that there's some sort of natural explanation for that, possibly a misdiagnosis. Maybe she's made the entire thing up. Maybe some sort of physiological thing happened that I don't know. And you know what? It doesn't even matter because it is just her. All a miracle says to the people who haven't had a miracle is that you don't deserve one. And that's just a reprehensible thing.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, where do you even start with something like that? Because, I mean, my heart goes out to Shannon. The majority of my interactions with her have been great. I think she's an awesome person, and I really like her. And so I feel bad for her. This is a problem for us as theists. I mean, this is essentially the problem of evil, just in the context of miracles. And it certainly was not my intention at all by asking you this question to weaponize Barbara's story. I just think that it's an amazing story that helps, as you mentioned earlier, about raising the prior probability. Right. And it's something that, I mean, if God does heal anybody, at least there's some less evil in the world. And I think I've looked into her case. I don't think that she's lying. I don't think that it's mistaken. Sure, people are writing books about it and they could stand to benefit financially from that, but she's offered to give her testimony. I have a hard time thinking she's piling up money or getting rich over this. And so I don't know. It's a hard thing. My heart definitely goes out to Shannon, and I know it's difficult, but yeah, what do you make of this miracles and the problem of evil?
Yeah. First of all, I echo what Erik has already said. My heart goes out to Shannon as well, and it's not our intention to weaponize this case. God works differently in different people's experience, and I don't believe that biblical teaching is that one is guaranteed healing. I would love if that was the case, but unfortunately, people do sometimes get sick, and it's not because of any sin in their lives or fault of their own. And as many people don't get healed, and that's sad, but that's the case. So we don't want to give people false hope, and we don't want to weaponize such stories. What I would say though is, first of all, Barbara's case is not unique. It's not the only case of healing, including healing from multiple sclerosis. There are a lot of stories like this, healing of other conditions as well, blindness and so forth. I recommend highly Craig Keener's work on this subject, especially his more condensed book, which is Miracles Today, which highlights some of the stronger examples. His 2-volume set covers a lot of examples, and there's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of strong and weak examples that he offers there. Miracles Today, it tends to highlight some of the stronger examples. I also recommend Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Miracles, and J.P. Moreland has done some great work on this subject too, as has Robert Larmer and others. So it's not a unique case, is the first point I would make. Secondly, in regards to why some people get healed and some people don't, we don't know the answer to that. Now, does that mean that they kind of cancel each other out? I would say that the cases where God does appear to perform a miracle are of greater evidential value than in confirming theism than those in which he doesn't. And the strongest cases, by the way, are those where there was multiple attestation to the before and after condition, as in the case of Barbara, incidentally. It's not just Barbara's own testimony, but there are physicians who attest to this, and other people that can vouch for her before and after condition. When it occurs in the context of prayer, which it does in the case of Barbara Snyder, and
she heard a voice. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
So it was in the context of prayer, and she also claims that she heard a voice audibly, which said something to the effect of "Get up, my child, and walk." And her legs had atrophied, and her feet were curled up, and she was able to stand flat on the floor, and her legs were no longer atrophied, and she was able to walk, and she was able to see again. And so when it occurs in the context of prayer, when it's when there are multiple independent witnesses that can verify it, when the healing occurs instantaneously rather than it being a gradual thing that you might be able to explain by some sort of remission naturally, or and also when it is enduring. So in the case of Barbara Snyder, at the time of the publication of Lee Strobel's book, it had been enduring for more than 35 years. So it's not just some sort of remitting and relapsing MS. And when it's when it fulfills those criteria, then these are the strongest examples, in my opinion, and these are much more difficult to explain through naturalistic means than the cases when someone doesn't get a miracle are to explain on Christianity. Right, so you have an epistemic asymmetry here. So what do I mean by epistemic asymmetry? So an epistemic asymmetry is where evidence that confirms a proposition might be stronger piece for piece than those data points that disconfirm it. So for example, if I see a spider on the table in front of me, that is very strong evidence for the hypothesis that somewhere in my apartment there's a spider. Whereas if I don't see a spider, that is some evidence against there being a spider in the apartment. I mean, I've sampled part of the apartment, but it's only very weak evidence comparatively. So that's what I mean by an epistemic asymmetry. In the case of healing miracles, the cases of healing where God does seem to perform miraculous healings, those seem to be much stronger evidence in confirming Christianity than the counterexamples where God doesn't heal are in disconfirming, because there's various plausible explanations why God may choose not to heal. And there's far more plausible explanations of why God might choose not to heal than there are naturalistic explanations for why sometimes he does heal. And so that would be my response to that particular concern.
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, it's I can understand the frustration that Shannon would have. But I just want to be clear, like, we're not saying God likes Barbara more than you or anything like that. Maybe this is just one of those things that's just very hard to hear, but I don't think it's like about being a good person or not being a good person. I mean, Jesus talks about there were plenty of lepers in the days of Elisha, and yet the only person who was healed was Naaman the Syrian. He was not a particularly good guy, but it was a sign to the people there, I suppose. But miracles, I do know, don't necessarily promise that you're going to have an easier life. I mean, Paul talks about the miracles that he performed, and yet he was persecuted from town to town. He had his own miracle of, at least according to the book of Acts, where he was partially, or he was blinded for a period of time.
Yeah.
but it didn't make his life easier. I think for me, I mean, my mom died before my son could be born. She had breast cancer. She didn't die of the breast cancer. She died later of a heart attack. And I mean, that was hard. And that was one of the biggest contributors to me at that particular time, to why I became an atheist as a teenager. But as you look at all of the evidence put together, and the fact that if Christianity is true, the God at the center of Christianity is not somebody who just stood idly by. He entered into our sufferings. He was mocked, spit upon, beaten, had a crown of thorns put on his head. He was scourged at a pillar by Romans for however long that lasted. He had to carry a cross to Golgotha and had nails driven through his hands and his feet. And the apostles that he commissioned out were also, in the case of Paul, the guy was stoned and beaten and, like I said, chased from town to town. And so we all suffer. It's just how we contextualize the suffering, I guess. And like I said, my heart goes out to her. Like I said, that's one reason for me, at least, Christianity makes sense, is because it's not like Allah. He's so far distant and removed from everything else. No, like God chose to become a person and suffer as we do, the worst possible imaginable suffering. And so, yeah, I just, Shannon, if you're listening, we weren't trying to weaponize anything.
She's in the chat also.
Yeah, we do. I understand where you're coming from, and yeah, I just want you to things to get better for you, and we do pray for you, whether that means a whole lot to you or not. And I'm not saying that to sound super pious or anything. I hope you see that it's out of a genuine care. So it's kind of a rough note to probably end on. You did say she's in the chat, so I'll take a look. Jonathan, do you have any final thoughts or?
No, I again call upon Paul to issue a retraction of his statements that he made on his video concerning my views. I hope that he sees through this live stream that he has grossly misrepresented my perspective on historiography in relation to the Gospels. And I would like to see him do better in future when he gives critiques of our arguments. But would love to see him be a man of honor and retract his previous statements and issue an apology for his misrepresentation of our perspective.
Okay. Yeah. And like I said, I hold myself to these standards too. So feel free to call me out if I've ever made a mistake. And Paul knows that I've made mistakes in the past, and I've tried to correct them as best as I can. And so to me, when it comes to apologetics and counter apologetics, listen, I know it gets clicks and I know it gets views. If you just really kind of dunk on the other person and all the other stuff. And I'm not saying that was necessarily Paul's motivation. Maybe he really just did misunderstand. I'll just assume the very best. Given what I saw, it did make it difficult to do that. I'll definitely say that. But I feel like this is an area, like my conversation that I had with Derek Lambert the other day on my channel. We sharply disagree on a number of different things, but we have fun talking to each other. We enjoy talking to each other, and I don't want to misrepresent him. I don't want to misrepresent anybody. I don't think he's trying to misrepresent me. I think he's trying to understand. At least he's willing to take the time, talk to me privately to understand our views. And so I just feel like there are better ways that we can do these things. And my hope is that this whole apologetics, counter apologetics industry thing is not just like this game of one-upmanship and dunking on the other person. Again, I know it gets views. I know this can be a business. I'm not criticizing Paul and saying that he's doing this just for business or just for show. I'll let him decide that between him and his own conscience. But I just want to encourage everybody who's involved in this particular field. Let's try and represent each other well. Let's try and represent each other fairly. Let's try and be compassionate towards one another. And yeah, let's just try and do as best as we possibly can. And I don't see why we can't enjoy nerdy things together. We like the text. We like this topic. Yes, at the end of the day, we strongly disagree on worldview issues and on things that we think really, really matter. But we could still, be friends at the end of the day and try and represent each other well. And this whole thing could be collegial and not just a game of like, I'm going to make this person look stupid. I'm going to make this person look bad. And so now we all kind of do things to get clicks, as long as we're delivering the truth and we're doing it in a kind way. I understand. I'm not saying we all got to be Mr. Rogers or something like that, and everything's got to be fluffy and wonderful. Like, no, but I just, again, would encourage folks, like, let's do the best that we can in properly representing each other. And so with that, thank you guys again for watching this stream. If you are dealing with doubts, check out talkaboutdoubts.com. Again, super helpful resource. I'm one of the counselors there. I've been on some of those calls, and it is a privilege to be a part of that. And it's wonderful to see the lights turn on in people's eyes as we're able to share with them this kind of information. And so definitely avail yourself to that. And thank you guys so much for watching, and you have a wonderful night.